He didn't steal with a gun. He used silence, numbers, and fear. By the time the country realized who he was, he already owned its wires, its railroads, and its future. Jay Gould built an empire with no fingerprints. But there's one move he made. One so cold, so calculated, it nearly broke the nation. And no one ever made him pay for it. This is the story of Jay Gould, a ruthless mastermind, a quiet billionaire, and the most dangerous robber baron the world has ever seen. Jay Gould was born on May 27, 1836, in a wooden farmhouse nestled in the quiet hills of Roxbury, New York. His father, John Burr Gould, struggled to keep the family farm alive, while his mother, Mary Moore, tried to protect her frail son from the harsh winters and the harder stares of neighbors. Jay was different. He was small, thin, and frequently ill, a child more at home with numbers than with boys his own age. He kept to himself, rarely laughed, and found no comfort in the chaos of farm life. While other children played with sticks and stones, Jay played with ideas. Long divisions, topographic maps, business ledgers. Even as a child, Gould looked at the world not with wonder, but with calculation. There were no toys in the Gould household, only books, and Jay devoured them. History, geography, mathematics. Anything that explained how power worked and how men got rich. He had no interest in fairy tales or morality tales. He wanted knowledge that served a purpose. At age 6, he was already correcting his teachers. By 10, he was studying trigonometry from borrowed manuals and memorizing land coordinates for fun. His quietness wasn't shyness. It was observation. Jay wasn't afraid of people. He simply didn't need them yet. While others learned from schoolmasters, Gould studied the behavior of adults like a strategist. And when he watched them fumble through life, he made a silent vow. He would never be one of them. His town barely noticed him. Gould wasn't the sort of boy people admired or pitied. He was just invisible. No one imagined that the silent child at the back of the church would one day command railroads, break Wall Street, and leave behind a fortune worth billions in today's dollars. But the signs were already there. Even at home, Jay questioned why his father worked endlessly with so little to show for it. Why plow for pennies when other men held deeds, traded land, and slept warm? The math didn't add up, and Jay Gould didn't believe in suffering if it had no yield. He had no tolerance for failure, especially failure that came from tradition. Isolation became fuel. He learned early that solitude gave him an edge. While others needed praise, Jay needed progress. His health remained fragile throughout his childhood, forcing him to stay indoors, but he turned that into a private workshop. He drew maps, recorded rainfall, studied population trends in local townships. He calculated everything, from milk yields to migration routes. By the time most boys were learning how to harness a mule, Jay was learning how to harness data. And while his family wished he'd be more sociable, they never stopped him. Because despite his coldness, Jay never gave them a reason to worry, only a reason to wonder. By age 14, Jay Gould had already set himself apart. He hadn't inherited land. He hadn't earned a job title. But he had something more dangerous. He had a plan. He understood that in America, opportunity wasn't given. It was extracted. And he wasn't going to wait for permission. He believed power belonged to the man who studied longer, moved faster, and revealed nothing until the deal was already done. Roxbury raised him, but it was the lack of attention that sharpened him. The fewer people who noticed Jay Gould, the more he could see what they couldn't. By the time Jay reached his mid-teens, he had already outgrown the mental ceiling of Roxbury. While others were concerned with cows and crop prices, Jay became obsessed with topography. Not just the shape of the land, but how it could be measured, monetized, and moved through. He taught himself advanced geometry and became proficient with a surveyor's compass. learning to chart terrain with military-level precision. His notebooks became filled with line coordinates and slope calculations. Surveying wasn't just a trade to him, it was control, and he realized early that the men who owned the maps often ended up owning the land. He soon convinced a local businessman to hire him to map Ulster County. It was a bold request. Jay was barely 16, thin, pale, and unknown, but his intensity left no room for doubt. He worked through sweltering summers and freezing winds, often walking over 20 miles a day with his chain and compass. His body ached, his boots cracked, but the land opened itself to him. And when the maps were delivered, they were so accurate that local officials used them for years to come. Jay was no longer just a sickly boy from the hills. He was now a professional surveyor and one of the youngest in the state. This first contract led to more. Gould's name began to spread, not in social circles, but in business ones. Men with capital started whispering about the boy with a sharp eye and sharper mind. Jay kept his prices low and his results perfect. He quickly learned how to manipulate terrain data to favor one investor over another, all while pretending to be neutral. It was a trick that would later define his entire career. Appear objective while gaining everything. He didn't need to lie outright, he simply needed to control what others saw. By 17, he wasn't just drawing maps, he was playing men. He kept his true ambitions hidden. He listened far more than he spoke, and rarely revealed his opinions unless there was money on the table. In one meeting, an older landowner mocked Jay's age and asked if he knew anything about risk. Jay looked him in the eye and replied, "I know enough to let you take it." That response wasn't witty, it was calculated. Jay Gould wasn't interested in charm, he was interested in leverage. And if that meant sounding cold, so be it. The more underestimated he was, the easier it became to outmaneuver those around him. His surveying contracts allowed him to quietly gather land intelligence across multiple counties. He began collecting detailed data on farmland, rivers, trade routes, and town growth projections. But unlike other surveyors, Gould never stopped at the edges of his job. He used every project to look for weakness. Who was over-leveraged? Which farms had poor drainage? Which towns were ripe for railroads but didn't know it yet? Jay wasn't just mapping land. He was mapping an opportunity, and his ability to see value before others saw it became his most dangerous skill. By 1856, Jay Gould made his first serious move into ownership. With $5,000 in savings from surveying and a loan from a business partner, he invested in a tannery in Pennsylvania. Leather was booming, demand was high. But this wasn't a passion investment, it was strategic. Jay knew the leather trade relied on supply chains most businessmen didn't understand. Forest for bark, streams for water, and railroads for delivery. While his older partner focused on production, Gould focused on the ledgers. He analyzed every cost, every shipment, and quickly realized the numbers didn't favor the current ownership model. In less than a year, Gould maneuvered to take over the entire operation. His partner, older, louder, more experienced, suddenly found himself outplayed by a teenager. Gould renegotiated deals, cut labor costs, and began squeezing suppliers. His tactics were aggressive but legal, and more importantly, they worked. Within months, the tannery turned a solid profit. Jay reinvested everything, buying more land, expanding operations, and making sure all control flowed through him. This was the first time Jay Gould outwitted a senior partner. But it wouldn't be the last, and it taught him a lesson he would never forget. The man who owns the numbers owns the business. That tannery became more than a business. It became his first empire. From there, Gould began issuing reports that looked like analysis, but were really advertisements for himself. He cultivated a reputation as a boy genius, knowing full well that the myth would open more doors than the truth. He wrote a book on leather production and printed it himself, ensuring his name appeared in trade circles. He studied how rumors moved through markets. He began experimenting with information control. Jay wasn't just learning how to manage companies. He was learning how to manipulate perception, and behind all of it, his philosophy took shape. Gould came to believe that people didn't care about truth. They cared about results. They didn't reward fairness. They rewarded control. He once told an associate, "The world belongs to the man who sees its weakness." That sentence, quiet and surgical, explained his entire future. He saw other men's hope as a liability. He saw their trust as an opening. Where most sought fairness, Gould sought leverage. He didn't want to be loved. He didn't even want to be seen. He just wanted to win and leave no fingerprints behind. Those who met Jay during this time didn't know what to make of him. He was polite, distant, and efficient. He didn't boast, didn't drink, and rarely laughed. He didn't seem like a man building an empire, but he was. Behind closed doors, he moved like a chess player with 3 boards open. He studied timber markets in one state while researching bond yields in another. Every decision was calculated to increase control without increasing attention. And while other men chased fame, Jay Gould chased silence. Because in silence, no one knew what to defend. By 1859, Jay Gould had sold a tannery and made his first real fortune. He was just 23, but he didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party. Instead, he moved to New York City, quietly. Because for Jay Gould, Roxbury had served its purpose. The boy who mapped hills now planned to map America. And he didn't need friends, cheerleaders, or permission. He just needed time. And a crack in the system wide enough to slip through. When Jay Gould arrived in New York City in 1856, no one noticed. He didn't announce himself. He didn't dress to impress. He moved through the city like a man who had been planning this step for years. And he had. New York was crowded, noisy, and impatient. But Gould was none of those things. He watched, he listened, he asked the right questions, and kept the important answers to himself. He wasn't there to chase opportunity. He was there to build it in silence. At first, Gould lived modestly. A rented room, simple meals, no parties, no introductions. He understood the value of keeping overhead low while watching others burn through theirs. He walked Wall Street's corridors like a ghost, studying deals, analyzing failures. This was a city built on speed and speculation. Men made fortunes before breakfast and lost them by sunset. But while others moved fast, Gould moved precisely. He didn't want attention. He wanted access. Within months, he connected with smaller financiers and speculators who had more ambition than wisdom. Gould offered services others overlooked, mapping supply routes, evaluating company ledgers, predicting commodity prices. He made himself useful, never loud, and soon he earned the notice of bigger names. But he refused to show his full hand. The city was crawling with gamblers dressed as businessmen. Jay wasn't interested in luck. He wanted leverage. What struck people about Gould wasn't just his quiet nature, it was his discipline. He had no patience for small talk, no desire for public praise. He wrote everything down, from market trends to political whispers. He learned quickly that the men who looked like winners were often already sinking. Appearances meant nothing to him. Only numbers, contracts, and silence had value. In a city obsessed with fast money, Jay Gould became the one man who waited. By 1859, Gould had made enough money from speculative investments and railroad studies to begin taking real positions in companies. He wasn't flashy about it. He bought small, but made sure those positions came with inside access. When people wondered who this pale young man was sitting in executive meetings, he offered no explanation. That was the point. The less they knew, the more they underestimated him. And Jay Gould loved being underestimated. Everything changed when Gould met Daniel Drew, one of Wall Street's most notorious manipulators. Drew was a former cattle drover turned financier, known for his shady tactics and deep pockets. He took a liking to Gould, not because of his charm, but because of his cold precision. Drew saw in Gould a younger version of himself, without the guilt or hesitation. And Gould saw in Drew something else entirely, a blueprint. Drew introduced Gould to stock watering, the practice of inflating a company's value by issuing shares far beyond its actual worth. It was legal back then, or at least unregulated, and incredibly effective. Drew showed him how to use press leaks, political connections, and fake announcements to move markets. Gould watched, memorized, and copied. To him, this wasn't corruption, it was education. It was how the game was played. With Drew's backing, Gould began investing in the Erie Railroad, a company riddled with financial problems and political battles. He didn't invest for growth, he invested for control. He realized that you didn't have to build the train to own the tracks, you just had to own the boardroom. He quietly aligned with other insiders, bought debt, and leveraged that debt into voting power. The Erie Railroad would become a battleground later in his career. But this was the beginning. Gould also learned how to use rumors as weapons. With Drew's help, he began planting news stories about competitor rail lines being unsafe, broke, or mismanaged. When stock prices dropped, he swooped in and bought them cheap. He started using dummy agents to buy shares for him, so no one knew what he controlled until it was too late. It wasn't just about profit. It was about being invisible and dangerous at the same time. Drew trusted Gould, but only to a point. He didn't know that his young protege was already outpacing him mentally. Gould learned quickly where Drew's tactics were weak, too emotional, too theatrical. Gould didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he just moved in silence, corrected for Drew's mistakes, and never made the same one twice. Drew may have taught him the game, but Gould intended to rewrite the rules. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the country descended into chaos. But for Jay Gould, it opened a door. The war created desperation, disorganization, and demand. A perfect environment for someone who thrived in confusion. Gould didn't take sides. He didn't care who won, he cared who paid. And both the union and private businesses were paying a lot for rails, bonds, copper, and gold. Gould began trading in railroad securities and war bonds, using insider tips and chaotic wartime pricing to his advantage. He invested in northern railroads that transported troops and supplies, knowing that the government contracts would keep them afloat, even if their finances were weak. He bought them when others were panicking, then flipped them when the military renewed their contracts. It wasn't luck, it was perfect timing, based on analysis no one else was doing. He also started trading in gold, a market that became volatile as people feared inflation and currency collapse. While patriotic investors stayed loyal to Union currency, Gould quietly amassed gold and shorted federal greenbacks. As the war dragged on and fears rose, the price of gold soared. Gould didn't just follow the market, he predicted it. And more importantly, he manipulated it, using brokers and anonymous purchases to create spikes he could sell into. Jay also capitalized on wartime supply shortages, partnering with contractors and suppliers who were overwhelmed by the surge in demand. He would buy their debts, renegotiate their contracts, and absorb their assets, turning temporary crises into long-term profits. While generals worried about battlefields, Gould focused on the logistics behind the bloodshed. He didn't need to march, he needed to calculate, and that's exactly what he did. By the end of the war, Jay Gould had multiplied his wealth and expanded his control over rail interests. But his face never appeared in newspapers. His name didn't become part of patriotic ballads. He had made money quietly, brutally, and with absolute detachment. While the nation mourned its dead, Gould tightened his grip on its infrastructure. For him, war wasn't tragedy, it was opportunity. But even Jay Gould wasn't immune to betrayal. As his profits rose, his mentor Daniel Drew grew more erratic. Drew began making reckless bets on the Erie Railroad, trying to outplay Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man with deeper pockets and less patience. Drew pulled Gould into the middle of it, expecting loyalty. But Gould had outgrown his mentor. He saw Drew's moves as sloppy, desperate, emotional. And worst of all, he was making enemies they couldn't beat. In 1866, Drew used Gould to help flood the market with unauthorized Erie stock to drive down prices and hurt Vanderbilt. Gould went along at first, thinking it was another trick, but he soon realized Drew was no longer playing smart. The plan backfired. Legal threats poured in. Vanderbilt was furious and had the political muscle to fight back. When things got tight, Drew left Gould exposed, blaming him for the manipulation. That moment changed everything. Gould managed to survive the fallout. He covered his tracks, used legal loopholes, and leaned on new allies. But something in him broke. Trust, what little he had for anyone, was gone. He had believed, maybe just briefly, that alliances could work, that mentorship could mean something. But Drew had reminded him of the truth. In finance, everyone is a weapon, and every partnership has an expiration date. From that moment forward, Jay Gould changed. He became colder, more reserved, more surgical. He no longer took advice. He no longer shared his plans. Every move became layered, protected by shells of misinformation and disinformation. He made sure no single person ever had the full picture. He built networks of lawyers, agents, and middlemen to speak for him, while he stayed hidden in the shadows. The Civil War had made him rich, but betrayal made him dangerous. He wasn't just a speculator now, he was a tactician. He saw every man's ambition as a weakness to be exploited. He no longer believed in fair games, only fixed ones. The boy from Roxbury was gone, and in his place stood a man who would make Wall Street bleed without ever raising his voice. By the late 1860s, the Erie Railroad was bleeding money. Its lines were overbuilt, its board in disarray, and its stock sinking fast. For most men, that would signal retreat, but not for Jay Gould. He saw weakness as opportunity. And he wasn't the only one. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, had already swallowed up the Harlem and New York Central railroads. Now he wanted Erie, and he had the cash to take it. Gould didn't stand alone. He partnered with Daniel Drew, his former mentor, and James Fisk Jr., a loud and flamboyant showman with a taste for theater and risk. The three made an odd group: an aging manipulator, a soft-spoken strategist, and a carnival barker. But they shared one goal: keep Vanderbilt out. Control of Erie meant control of key rail routes and enormous freight profits. It also meant a platform for even bigger moves. Vanderbilt struck first. He began quietly buying Erie stock in large quantities, certain that volume and wealth would carry the day. He was used to winning with blunt force, but Gould had already anticipated this. He understood that the stock market wasn't just numbers. It was a game of pressure, panic, and illusion. He didn't just defend, he set a trap, one that would make Wall Street history and forever change Gould's reputation. Behind the scenes, Gould and Fisk arranged for the illegal printing of thousands of Erie shares. These new shares had no value, but on paper, they flooded the market. As Vanderbilt bought, his control weakened. He didn't know that the very shares he fought for were being counterfeited from within the company. By the time he realized it, it was too late. His millions were chasing phantoms. Gould kept quiet during this storm. Fisk played the fool in public, joking with reporters and throwing lavish parties to distract attention. But it was Gould who executed the finer points. He rewrote board votes, engineered legal loopholes, and kept Drew at bay just long enough to get what he needed. Vanderbilt had never been outplayed in his career, but now he found himself facing a new kind of rival, one who didn't need to be stronger, just sharper. By March of 1868, the control war had reached a boiling point. Vanderbilt filed lawsuits. Boardroom votes turned into shouting matches. The company's headquarters became a fortress. Yet for all the noise, it was clear who held the real power. Gould and Fisk now had the majority vote. The Erie Railroad, once headed for Vanderbilt's pocket, was firmly in their grip. Once the fake shares were in circulation, Gould needed one more thing to make them stick: legitimacy. So he went to the place where laws could be bent for a price: Albany, New York. There, he used bribes and backroom promises to push through a bill that retroactively legalized the unauthorized shares. It was bold, it was dirty, but it worked. The paper trail was now protected by actual law. Vanderbilt fought back, taking the battle to court. But even that played into Gould's hands. With the law on his side, bought or not, he could drag the case out indefinitely. Every motion, every hearing became just another delay. Meanwhile, Gould and Fisk operated as if victory had already been declared. They replaced board members, rewrote charters, and acted with total authority. And technically, they weren't wrong. Gould had turned the stock exchange into a stage for illusions. While Vanderbilt held certificates, Gould held votes. While the Commodore shouted fraud, Gould whispered process. And behind every whisper was a paid lawmaker ready to stall, rewrite, or bury. Gould didn't need to win a moral fight. He needed to win the numbers. And with every forged signature and purchased opinion, the scoreboard tilted further his way. The final insult came not from Gould, but from Fisk. In a press stunt, Fisk publicly thanked Vanderbilt for his generous contributions to the Erie treasury. It was mockery of the highest order, but it revealed the confidence they now held. Vanderbilt's power had limits, and Gould had found them. He had taken millions from the richest man in America and turned them into dust. People began to question how far Gould would go. But the better question was, how far would the system let him go? At a time when stock manipulation had no real penalties, and political corruption was part of business, Gould was simply playing better than anyone else. He didn't invent these tools, he simply sharpened them to perfection. And Wall Street had no answer. By the time Vanderbilt settled, accepting partial repayment just to end the chaos, the war was effectively over. The Erie Railroad was in Gould's control. His reputation was cemented, not as a businessman, not even as a tycoon, but as something more dangerous, a man who had rewritten the rules mid-game and still managed to win. Control of Erie wasn't enough. Gould wanted protection, real protection. So he built it, brick by brick, through corruption. He bought legislators in Albany. He paid judges under the table. He slipped favors to police commissioners. His lawyers weren't just defenders, they were gatekeepers. With every check written, Gould made it harder for any court to touch him. He didn't just buy protection, he built a legal fortress. Even when courts tried to intervene, conflicting injunctions arrived within hours, one judge ordering his arrest, another blocking it. Gould's team played courts against each other, filing in multiple jurisdictions, ensuring that no single authority had full control. It was legal chaos, but it bought time, and in Gould's world, time was leverage. Every delay let him move assets, rewrite books, or erase evidence. Gould's influence stretched into the New York Police Department. Officers who once served warrants now stalled them. Investigators got reassigned. Judges received surprise visitors from Erie executives. If pressure came from one direction, Gould released it in another. He controlled the system without ever having to be the face of it. He had made New York his boardroom, and every piece on it was rented or owned. Meanwhile, Fisk distracted the public. He held banquets, told jokes, paraded through city halls like a stage actor. The media loved him, and Gould let him take the spotlight. It kept cameras away from the real deals, the paperwork, the financial tricks, the cash-stuffed envelopes. Fisk was the noise. Gould was the signal behind it all. And as long as the public watched the clown, the magician could finish the trick. People began whispering about a new kind of power, not political, not industrial, but shadowed power, quiet power. A man who couldn't be elected, couldn't be jailed, and couldn't be stopped. Gould wasn't just a businessman. He had become untouchable, and no one had ever seen that kind of figure in American finance before. By the end of 1868, Gould's hold on the Erie wasn't just financial, it was structural. The very mechanisms of accountability, law, regulation, police, had all been bought. And if they hadn't, they'd been silenced. The system hadn't failed. It had been hijacked, and Jay Gould sat at the wheel. Then the tide shifted. With public outrage rising and the press catching up, Threats of arrest started growing louder. One judge issued a new warrant. Whispers of federal involvement crept in. For the first time, Gould and Fisk felt the heat. So, they ran. In the middle of the night, they crossed the Hudson River into New Jersey, carrying boxes of documents, checks, and stock certificates. They settled into the Taylor Hotel in Jersey City, turning it into an impromptu fortress. Armed guards stood at the doors. Inside, the two men worked tirelessly. Gould sorting legal documents, Fisk giving statements to the press. They weren't just hiding, they were still running the Erie Railroad from Exile. They used couriers to deliver instructions. They wired lawyers. They maintained control of the company, miles from its actual headquarters. Crossing state lines had protected them. New York's legal reach couldn't touch them in New Jersey. It was a bold play. Some called it cowardice. Others saw it as brilliant legal strategy. But for Gould, it was just another calculated move. He knew the rules, and when the rules got close, he changed the terrain. Even law had boundaries, and he had stepped just outside them. Fisk made the whole ordeal a circus. He invited reporters to his hotel room, told jokes, downplayed the scandal. He even joked that the only thing missing was champagne and a piano. But behind the curtains, Gould was working through night and day, reviewing contracts, destroying duplicates, and making sure nothing fell into the wrong hands. By the time pressure died down and they felt safe to return, much had changed. Opponents had burned out. Journalists had moved on. The scandal had lost its momentum. Once again, Gould had waited just long enough. The timing wasn't luck, it was design. Chaos was temporary, his control was not. Their return to New York was quiet. No arrests, no courtroom drama. Just two men walking back into their empire, untouched. They hadn't outrun the law, they had simply outsmarted it. As the dust settled, the story reached the masses. The Erie scandal became a media sensation. Newspapers described Gould and Fisk as thieves, liars, even traitors. Editorials called for their heads. Headlines screamed fraud. For a moment, it looked like public opinion might turn the tide, but Gould wasn't worried. Public rage, he knew, burns fast and fades faster. Fisk leaned into the image. He laughed in interviews, mocked his accusers. He made himself the villain and didn't care. It made for good press. And as long as the circus raged, Gould could work in peace. He had already moved on, shifting capital into other railroads, exploring new deals. While people talked about yesterday, he was preparing for what came next. Congress opened hearings. Politicians made speeches, but nothing came of it. Gould had kept just enough distance, just enough ambiguity to avoid direct punishment. No law had been clearly broken. No one could explain exactly what happened. And that confusion was his greatest shield. For the first time, America realized something chilling. Jay Gould didn't just play the game better than anyone. He was redefining the game entirely. He had proven that control didn't require truth. It didn't require popularity. It required foresight, speed, and the will to cross every line the moment it stopped being useful. The Erie War was over. But Gould's ascent was just beginning. He wasn't a name anymore. He was a force. And the financial world, once skeptical of his quiet methods, now feared him. Not because he was loud, but because he was always 5 moves ahead. In early 1869, Jay Gould saw something most others missed. After the Civil War, the US government was trying to return the country to a gold-backed currency. To stabilize the dollar, the Treasury regularly sold off gold reserves. That worked for the economy, but not for speculators. Gould didn't want stability. He wanted chaos he could control. And gold, he realized, was the perfect target. He teamed up once again with James Fisk. The plan was simple. Quietly buy up as much gold as they could. Drive the price sky high. Then sell it at the top. But they couldn't do it openly. If the Treasury got wind of it, they could crush the plan by releasing more gold. So the buying had to be secret. Quietly, through brokers, proxies, and shadow companies, they started to corner the market. Every day they purchased more, not just physical gold, but paper claims, futures, and contracts tied to it. They spread out their purchases to avoid suspicion, but behind the curtain, all the gold was being funneled into one growing pile, Gould's pile. As demand rose, so did the price, and with it, the pressure. Traders noticed the shift, whispers started, but no one could prove what was really happening. To keep momentum, Gould and Fisk controlled the messaging. They told brokers the government wouldn't interfere. They spread false rumors that President Grant supported a rising gold market. The plan worked. Investors piled in, pushing prices higher, chasing what they thought was a market trend. But in truth, it was a trap. One set by two men who were betting on the country's fear. What made this scheme even more dangerous was timing. Harvest season was ending. Farmers were about to sell their goods. Rising gold prices meant the dollar would weaken and wheat would sell for more. Rural America cheered. They thought they were winning. They had no idea that Gould's gold plot was about to shatter them. All it needed was one final piece: control of the government's gold policy. Fisk played the clown, as always, hosting parties, telling jokes, keeping attention on himself. Gould stayed behind the curtain, coordinating every move, making sure no detail slipped. They weren't gambling, they were executing, and they were dangerously close to pulling off one of the most destructive financial schemes in American history. Gould knew that if the Treasury sold gold, the whole plan would collapse. So he did what he always did when rules got in the way. He bought access. Through back channels and favors, he connected with Abel Corbin, President Ulysses S. Grant's brother-in-law. Corbin was well-placed, hungry for status, and eager for favors. Gould saw in him not just an ally, but a door. Corbin was invited into the operation slowly. Gould flattered him, offered investment opportunities, and hinted at a way to help the economy and himself. Corbin took the bait. Soon, he was feeding Gould with inside information from the Grant administration. What was the president planning? Would the Treasury sell gold? Every answer Corbin delivered helped shape the strategy. Gould wasn't guessing. He was planning with inside help. At one point, Gould even got Corbin to write letters to the president, warning against selling gold. The letters framed it as an economic concern, but the truth was clear. Gould needed Grant to stay out of the market, and for a time, it worked. The president didn't suspect a plot, the Treasury stayed quiet, and the gold price kept climbing. Investors poured in, the corner tightened. Grant's wife, Julia, was also pulled in. Through gifts and polite gestures, Gould and Fisk kept her comfortable. They weren't bribing her in the open, but the charm was constant. Dinners, flowers, subtle praise, all designed to keep the president's household feeling friendly. It was all psychological, soft power. Gould didn't need orders, he just needed silence. Meanwhile, Fisk made noise. He told everyone the president supported their position, that Grant wanted a strong gold market, that the government would stay out. These statements weren't true, but they weren't denied either. Corbin's presence gave them credibility. Wall Street believed it, and so the gold market continued to inflate, based not on policy, but on manipulated perception. By September 1869, the plan was in full motion. Gold was approaching $160 per ounce, up from $130 just weeks earlier. Farmers were holding their grain, traders were betting big, and all the while, Gould was calculating, watching the charts, planning the exit. He didn't want forever, he wanted the perfect peak, one final push, and then he would vanish with millions. Friday, September 24th, 1869. New York City woke up to a storm brewing on Wall Street. Gold prices had hit a fever pitch, $162. Panic was spreading. Men shouted in trading pits, shoving, waving contracts, screaming numbers. The floor shook with noise. Gould stayed calm. He had seen it all before, but this time even he knew something was about to snap. Rumors flew that the Treasury was preparing to intervene. Traders begged for clarity. Prices climbed anyway. People were desperate, not for profit, but to escape losses. Then, at 11 a.m., the news hit. the US Treasury would release $4 million in gold reserves. The floor went silent for a moment. Then it exploded. People ran for exits. Contracts evaporated. Fortunes were lost in minutes. Gold prices plummeted. $162 to $135 in less than an hour. Bankers fainted. Clerks wept at their desks. Brokers tore up paperwork. Outside the exchange, word spread like fire. Investors who had borrowed to buy gold were wiped out. Margin calls hit with no mercy. It wasn't just a price correction, it was a freefall, and no one saw it coming except Gould. While Fisk panicked, yelling at assistants and scrambling for cover, Gould had already begun pulling out. Quietly, he'd started selling earlier in the week. He knew the top wouldn't last, and while others chased the rise, he focused on the exit. His brokers sold off chunks of gold quietly, in layers. So when the collapse hit, Gould's fortune was mostly liquid, untouched. Fisk, however, lost heavily. He had believed in the plan, trusted Gould too much, but Gould didn't rescue him, he never warned him. Because Gould didn't operate on loyalty, he operated on timing. When Black Friday hit, it was every man for himself, and Gould had already secured his place on the lifeboat. By the end of the day, the gold corner was over, and Wall Street would never be the same. Not because a market failed, but because it had been manipulated from the inside by a man who treated national currency like a pawn. Jay Gould didn't just survive Black Friday, he won it. While Gould counted his profits, the rest of the country bled. Farmers across the Midwest who had held their grain expecting high prices now faced collapsing values. They had borrowed to plant, borrowed to wait, and now there was no payday. Some lost their land, some lost their homes, some took their own lives. The headlines were brutal, but the statistics were worse. Banks in smaller towns failed overnight. They had backed farmers who now couldn't pay. Rural communities that once saw gold as a path to profit now saw it as a wrecking ball. People begged for relief, but there was no safety net, no insurance, no federal bailout, just silence and the echo of a market that had turned on them. In cities, thousands of investors were ruined. Small-time traders who followed the gold trend lost their life savings. Some jumped from buildings. Others vanished in shame. The gold crash didn't just hurt the rich. It destroyed the middle, the hopeful, the cautious, the ones who followed the crowd, because that crowd had been led by a ghost. Even newspapers, many of whom had celebrated Gould and Fisk's boldness, now turned. Editorials called them criminals, moralists called it treason. But words couldn't reverse the damage. Gould wasn't in hiding. He didn't offer apologies. He didn't speak at all. He let others argue while he quietly returned to his routines. He had made his millions, and the rest was just noise. The damage wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Black Friday shattered trust in the system. It showed that one man, or two, could hijack the economy without firing a shot. There had been no war, no political collapse, no foreign attack, just strategy and silence. It was terrifying, and yet completely legal. And so the country mourned, not just the lost money, but the loss of confidence. The idea that America's markets were fair had been cracked, and Jay Gould had cracked it, not with weapons, but with paper, whispers, and timing. Outrage followed. Congress launched hearings. The House Committee on Banking called witnesses. They wanted answers. Who caused the crash? How had this been allowed? Who knew what and when? James Fisk testified, cracking jokes and deflecting blame. Abel Corbin fumbled through explanations, denying bribery but admitting conversations. But the man they wanted most, Gould, stayed quiet. Gould was careful. When forced to appear, he spoke only when needed. He gave vague responses, leaned on legal counsel, and avoided direct responsibility. He claimed he was simply a market participant, that he never intended harm, that he operated within the law, and technically, he was right. No law had been written to stop what he did. So he walked away clean. The committee issued reports. They called for reform. But nothing concrete happened. No indictments, no restitution. The crash had happened, the damage was done, and Gould's fortune remained intact. He had beaten the government, the market, and public opinion, all in the same month. It wasn't just victory, it was proof that he couldn't be touched. For the American people, it was a bitter pill. They had been taught that hard work paid off, that markets were fair, that justice followed outrage. But Gould had exposed something darker. That power in America didn't always wear a title. Sometimes it wore a quiet face and signed checks no one could trace. And so Black Friday faded, replaced by the next scandal, the next war, the next cycle. But its lesson remained. Jay Gould didn't cause a collapse by mistake. He caused it on purpose. And then, as others screamed, he moved on, colder, richer, and more dangerous than ever. For the first time, America realized that its economy wasn't untouchable. It could be bought, sold, and broken by one man in a quiet room with nothing more than a plan. After Black Friday, Jay Gould didn't stop to rest. He reloaded. Wall Street still echoed from the gold collapse, but Gould already had his sights on the next system to control: communication. Trains moved goods, but telegraphs moved power. Whoever controlled the wires controlled the decisions. And by the early 1870s, the king of that network was Western Union. Gould didn't just want a stake, he wanted everything. At first, he approached quietly. Small purchases, indirect influence. He used front companies to buy shares and stacked loyalists on the board. Western Union executives barely noticed the shift until it was too late. By the time they realized what was happening, Gould already owned enough to steer the direction of the company. He didn't make speeches, he made moves. And every move brought him closer to total control. Telegraph lines crisscrossed the country, from city centers to frontier posts. Western Union wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline. Messages of war, banking, trade, and news all passed through its cables. Gould saw this as more than technology. He saw it as national surveillance. By owning the wires, he could monitor flows of information, track competitors, and control timing in an era when minutes changed fortunes. He didn't innovate the system. He inherited it and then optimized it for dominance. Gould restructured the company's internal operations, replacing independent station managers with loyal agents. He centralized pricing, eliminated regional discounts, and ensured all contracts ran through a handful of executives. With that, every message, personal, financial, political, passed through hands that answered to him. Competitors tried to resist. Some formed new companies, others filed lawsuits, but Gould, true to form, didn't fight back in public. He tied them in legal knots, drained them with drawn-out cases, and bought off struggling networks at pennies on the dollar. Even when courts sided with rivals, enforcement fell apart because the people assigned to investigate, many of them had been paid already. By the mid-1870s, Western Union was no longer just a company. It was Gould's private information empire. He didn't need newspapers to know what was coming. He had the wires. He didn't wait for stock updates. He read the raw messages before anyone else. Jay Gould had made America's voice pass through his fingers, and no one could stop him. Telegraphs gave Gould eyes, railroads gave him muscle. After consolidating Western Union, Gould returned to the industry he understood best: rail. This time, he aimed west. His next target was Missouri Pacific, a struggling line with vast potential if restructured right. As always, Gould didn't rush in loudly. He bought slowly, gathered influence, and took control of the board before the public knew what happened. Once inside, he cut costs. Not just fluff. He went after wages, routes, and maintenance. The goal was profit and control. He didn't care about reputation, he cared about efficiency. Then came expansion. He grabbed stakes in Union Pacific, then moved south to the Texas and Pacific. With every mile of track, his reach grew. It wasn't just lines on a map, it was leverage over entire states. These railroads didn't just move goods, they dictated the fate of towns. A rail line could make a village rich or starve a city overnight. Gould understood this deeply. He rerouted traffic, closed terminals, and delayed shipments, all to pressure cities, force mergers, or destroy rivals. If a mayor refused his terms, the trains stopped. If investors resisted, rates doubled. No one knew where he'd strike next. What made it worse was his secrecy. Gould didn't publicize decisions. He didn't tour rail yards or speak to unions. He stayed in New York, reading dispatches from thousands of miles away. Yet, with a simple order, he could collapse markets, delay war supplies, or bankrupt competitors. Governors feared him. Local businessmen begged for contracts. Even Congress found it difficult to track his moves. At his peak, Gould controlled more than 15,000 miles of track. His railroads stretched from Kansas to the Gulf, from Chicago to Denver. He created the first real continental freight empire, but did it from the shadows? No railroad baron was more efficient, more feared, or less trusted. And that was exactly how Gould liked it. In public, he appeared as a soft-spoken, sickly man in a black coat. In practice, he was an invisible tyrant, with steel rails running from his mind to America's fields, factories, and frontiers. Jay Gould didn't just move trains, he moved economies. With Western Union in one hand and major railroads in the other, Gould had something no other capitalist could match: an intelligence network. He didn't just control communication, he mined it. Every financial transaction, every shipping request, every insider memo passing over his telegraph lines could be intercepted. Gould wasn't just reading the market, he was listening to its secrets in real time. He installed loyal agents inside key telegraph offices, particularly near banks, trading houses, and competitor railroads. These men flagged patterns, paused suspicious wires, and quietly passed Gould the details. He wasn't reading every message. He didn't need to. He had eyes everywhere. Rivals were planning deals, raising funds, launching new routes, unaware that Gould knew before they even signed the paperwork. His knowledge edge was enormous. He'd buy shares in a competitor minutes before their own expansion news became public. He'd undercut rates in towns before rival trains even arrived. He manipulated freight contracts so that competitors unknowingly carried goods at a loss. This wasn't luck, it was weaponized knowledge, and no one could match it. Even more chilling, Gould began feeding false information back into the wire. He'd plant fake news about stock crashes, changes in grain prices, or delays in shipping. Traders reacted immediately, selling or hoarding based on what they thought was real. Gould, always one step ahead, cashed in on the chaos he'd scripted. It wasn't just information control, it was market manipulation at the root level. Attempts to expose him failed. Every time someone brought evidence, it vanished in court. Witnesses recanted. Judges lost their appetite for investigation. And by then, the damage had been done. Gould didn't need approval. He needed confusion. While critics searched for facts, he moved on to his next strategy, leaving behind only rumors and wreckage. To the public, Gould was a ghost. His name appeared in print, but his methods never left a trail. People began calling him the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, not because he was loud, but because no one could prove how he always seemed to know. For Gould, towns were not communities. They were data points. The only thing that mattered was revenue per mile. If a route didn't produce profits, he cut it. If a farmer couldn't pay the freight, he raised the rate. His railroads began squeezing small towns, doubling prices, rerouting deliveries, shutting down stations overnight. Entire communities woke up to find their lifeline to the world gone. Farmers were hit the hardest. They relied on trains to move their crops to city markets. But Gould's railroads began charging rural stops 2 to 3 times more than urban ones. It didn't matter that they grew the food. It only mattered that they couldn't fight back. For every bushel they sold, more went to transportation than to their pockets. And Gould didn't flinch. Anger turned to outrage. Farmers formed coalitions. Towns held protests. Newspapers ran stories about railroad robbery. But Gould didn't respond. He never gave speeches or interviews. He didn't defend himself. He simply waited for pressure to die. And it often did. Lawsuits took years. Politicians caved. The trains kept running, but only when he wanted them to. The press began framing him as a national villain. Editorial cartoons showed him with puppet strings, controlling railroads, farmers, and even Congress. He was called a parasite, a tyrant, a silent king, but none of it mattered. Gould wasn't seeking admiration. He was seeking dominance. Every complaint reminded him that he still held the upper hand. People begged the government to step in, and eventually they did. The Granger laws were passed, attempting to regulate freight rates, but enforcement was weak. Gould used lawyers to tie up rulings. By the time fines were issued, he had already changed routes, shifted assets, or created shell companies to take the hit. Nothing stuck, and the farmers continued to bleed. This wasn't just a business model, it was industrial extraction. Squeeze every penny from the powerless, feed it into a machine no one could stop. And standing at the center of that machine, cold and quiet, was Jay Gould. In 1877, the pressure finally snapped. The country was in depression, factories had closed, unemployment soared, and Gould's railroads, despite record profits, slashed wages again. Engineers, brakemen, and conductors, already earning little, were pushed beyond survival. This time, they didn't write letters, they didn't file complaints. They walked off the job and blocked the trains. The strike began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and spread like wildfire. Workers from the Baltimore and Ohio joined in, then Pittsburgh, then Chicago. Rail yards were overtaken, trains were halted. In some cities, entire rail lines were shut down. Crowds gathered, anger boiled, and when Gould refused to negotiate, things turned violent. In Pittsburgh, rail cars were set on fire, roundhouses burned, state militia were called in. But some refused to shoot. In other cities, troops opened fire. Dozens of workers were killed. Gould stayed silent. He issued no public statement. But in private, he reportedly said, "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half." Whether or not he meant it, the message was clear. Resistance would be met with force. Gould called in federal troops. The government complied. It wasn't just about keeping trains running. It was about keeping order, and order, in Gould's world, meant obedience. The strike lasted weeks. In the end, it failed. Workers were replaced. Leaders were blacklisted, and wages stayed low. Gould didn't lose a cent. But the country lost something bigger, its illusion of balance. After the smoke cleared, America realized what it was dealing with. Gould wasn't just a businessman. He was an infrastructure emperor. He owned the wires, he owned the rails. And now, he had proven that he could crush resistance with the stroke of a pen. The Great Strike didn't break Gould. It confirmed him. As the ghost king of American industry, untouchable, unseen, and unchallenged. Behind all the headlines, away from the boardrooms and backroom deals, Jay Gould lived a life few people ever saw. He didn't host galas. He rarely entertained strangers. His home was his fortress. Inside that quiet world, he wasn't the ruthless robber baron. He was a husband to Helen Day Miller and a father to 6 children. While the country raged outside, Gould's family gathered each evening, around a dinner table that doubled as a business classroom. He didn't believe in shielding his children from the real world. He believed in preparing them for it. At dinner, he discussed trade wars, balance sheets, and stock trends. His sons learned early how to read financial papers, how to track commodities, and how to judge a man's character from his handshake. He didn't lecture. He tested. He expected answers. Business wasn't a job, it was survival. And he raised them to survive. His mansion on Fifth Avenue wasn't a monument to wealth. It was a closed world. Staff were loyal, visitors rare, and conversation carefully managed. Gould kept his personal habits discreet. No drinking, no gambling, no mistresses. He didn't crave distraction. He craved stability, a quiet space to control what he could and filter out everything he didn't. In a world where the powerful flaunted their success, Gould retreated into calculated silence. Despite his cold image in public, his children remembered him as attentive, methodical, and occasionally affectionate. He rarely raised his voice, but he never repeated himself. If you didn't listen the first time, that was on you. His wife described him as gentle but unbending, a man who could be warm in private but would never allow himself to appear soft in public. Emotion, to Gould, was a liability. Even love had its limits. He maintained strict routines: early mornings, long hours with newspapers, quiet evenings with ledgers. He read voraciously, especially historical accounts of empire builders, generals, and financiers. Not for admiration, but for insight. He wanted to know how power survived and what mistakes killed it. His private library held thousands of titles, most of them filled with margin notes only he could decipher. Those closest to him understood the contradiction. Jay Gould had no interest in being loved, but he fiercely loved control. And within the walls of his home, that control meant order, preparation, and legacy. His public life was a war zone, but his private life, structured, disciplined, and intentional, was the foundation of everything he built. By the 1890s, Jay Gould's net worth exceeded $70 million, an amount that today would be measured in the billions. He wasn't just one of the richest men in America, he was one of the most feared, but what made him different was where that wealth went. Unlike many of his peers, Gould didn't spend lavishly or build monuments. He invested his fortune in something far more personal: his bloodline. He structured trusts, created holding companies, and positioned each of his children to inherit power, not just cash. His eldest son, George Jay Gould, was groomed from the age of 12 to run railroads. He attended board meetings with his father, asked questions, and soon took control of Missouri Pacific. By the time Jay Gould passed, George was already seated in his father's chair, ready to continue the family empire. The daughters weren't excluded either. Though they weren't placed in executive roles, they were taught to manage estates, negotiate art deals, and handle legal affairs. Gould made sure no part of his wealth could be eroded by ignorance. Every child received a portion, but more importantly, they received training. In his mind, inheritance without knowledge was an invitation to ruin. The Goulds entered high society through marriage, not charm. His daughter Helen married into European aristocracy. Another daughter became a prominent philanthropist, though even her generosity carried echoes of her father's structure. Money was never handed out without conditions. The family moved in circles that once mocked their name, but money won that deep, overpowered memory. Even after his death, Gould's presence lingered in financial circles. His trusts continued to manipulate markets, influence board elections, and shape national policy. His children, especially George, faced fierce criticism, accused of continuing the same underhanded tactics. But they didn't deny it. Because for the Gould family, criticism wasn't a wound, it was a sign of control. Within a decade of his passing, the Gould dynasty was seated firmly among America's most elite. Not by charm, not by name, but by unshakable financial architecture that Jay Gould had laid brick by brick. He didn't just leave behind a fortune, he left a playbook, and his children never stopped using it. On December 2nd, 1892, Jay Gould died in his mansion, surrounded by family, at just 56 years old. The official cause was tuberculosis, though years of stress, overwork, and secrecy had taken their toll long before the disease claimed him. His final weeks were quiet, no fanfare, no interviews, no public farewell, just silence. As always, he slipped out as quietly as he had entered. Doctors had warned him for years: the persistent cough, the night sweats, the weight loss, but Gould never paused. He dismissed pain as weakness. For decades, he had survived scandal, betrayal, and national outrage. A sickness to him was just another test of endurance. Even as his lungs failed, he worked, reading reports, signing papers, preparing the final arrangements of a life that never left anything to chance. His children stood by him, not with tears, but with notebooks. He gave final instructions, not for eulogies, but for mergers, court cases, and contracts. Until the end, his mind was on logistics. In his final hours, he asked to see his ledgers, not for greed, for reassurance, that everything was where it should be. Jay Gould didn't believe in faith. He believed in calculation. The country reacted with mixed emotion. Wall Street paused. Papers published obituaries filled with contradictions. One called him a genius. Another called him a national disgrace. Some mourned him as a self-made icon. Others cursed him as the man who broke farmers, crushed workers, and made honesty feel obsolete. Even in death, he divided the nation. His funeral was private. Few from the financial world attended. No grand ceremonies, no crowds lining the streets. Just a closed circle and a casket carried out of a building that had once housed the most dangerous mind in American business. Jay Gould didn't die a martyr. He died a machine unplugged. And yet, the silence after his death felt heavier than any celebration. Because everyone understood something frightening. Jay Gould was gone. But the systems he built were still running, and no one knew how to stop them. Even now, historians can't agree on what Jay Gould really was. To some, he was the dark genius of capitalism, a man who exposed the weaknesses in America's financial systems and played them like a piano. To others, he was a villain, the living proof that unchecked greed could hollow out a country. But neither side denies his power. They only disagree on what it meant. Supporters point to his brilliance. He built empires from nothing. He outsmarted titans. He moved markets with ideas, not armies. He didn't inherit privilege, he seized it. In an era where wealth was worshipped, Gould didn't apologize for having it. He simply reminded the world that fortune favored the focused. Discipline was his religion. Critics argue that he shattered public trust, that every scandal, every manipulation, every price hike was an assault on American stability. They say he wasn't just a businessman, he was a saboteur in a suit. He didn't create jobs, he created control. While others built things, Gould bought the maps and rewrote the borders. His legacy splits along moral lines. He didn't give to charity, he didn't invest in art, culture, or civic pride. He invested in leverage, in ownership, in silence. He didn't seek a statue, he sought permanence. And perhaps he got it, not in bronze, but in the architecture of the financial world he reshaped. Journalists kept writing about him long after his death. Some cursed him in editorials. Others analyzed his strategies like scholars. Even those who hated him admitted his influence. Gould had become a ghost in America's economic machine, one who whispered from ledgers, not graves. A reminder that power doesn't always look like a hero or a villain. Sometimes it just looks like a man with more time, more data, and fewer rules. So what was Jay Gould? A genius? A criminal? Or just a mirror, reflecting the darker truth that in America, the most dangerous kind of man is the one who doesn't need to be seen at all. Jay Gould never met Jeff Bezos, never traded emails with hedge fund managers, but his fingerprints are everywhere, in the way mergers happen, in how markets move, in how companies protect power. Rockefeller studied him. Morgan feared him. Every tycoon that followed him borrowed something from his strategy, his silence, or his cold refusal to explain himself. John D. Rockefeller once said, "The way to make money is to buy when blood is running in the streets." That mindset, opportunistic, unflinching, echoed Gould's career. Gould didn't just influence tactics, he influenced temperament. He showed that emotion could be a trap, that businessmen shouldn't wait for luck, they should manufacture it. J.P. Morgan built order where Gould built confusion. But even Morgan learned from his predecessor's ghost. Morgan used consolidation and negotiation. But when faced with market chaos, he he still relied on the same tools: secrecy, speed, and structure. In many ways, Gould had taught everyone what to avoid and what to adopt quietly when the stakes were high. Today's hedge funds, private equity firms, and algorithmic traders all operate on a Gould-like model. Data, timing, silence. Win without being seen. Trade without showing your hand. Make money off volatility, then step back before blame arrives. Modern Wall Street is louder, faster, and global. But the principles, the bones of the game, still Gouldian to their core. Even the language remains. Short selling, market manipulation, pump and dump. Gould was doing it before those phrases existed. And while laws now exist to stop such tactics, loopholes remain. Lawyers still play his game, politicians still hesitate, and traders still ask the same quiet question. What would Gould do here? He never ran for president, never led a war, but Jay Gould ruled from behind the curtain. And even today, when markets tremble and headlines scream, the smartest men on Wall Street still act like he's watching, because in some ways, he still is.